understand this region. I think you know that the Iranians are not Arabs. But for a lot of people, this is the same thing. They don't make a difference between a Persian and an Arab. This is the Middle East. They are all Arabs. They are all Muslims, and period. This is as simple as that. And don't underestimate the stupidity of people. Don't underestimate the stupidity and the ignorance. I think this is a French prime minister who used to say that. Don't underestimating stupidity. Because a lot of people don't know. These people, they have never traveled, never been there, they don't understand. And we have to see that Iran has, especially in the modern part of Iran's history, Iran has always tried to get closer to the West. They have seen the West as a model somehow, and they always tried to get closer to the West. The problem is that just after World War II, we were still in this kind of colonial mentality, especially from the West. So nobody paid attention to that. And you had new forms of colonialism that developed and that extended over the whole Middle East. But one thing we shouldn't forget, Iran is something like more than 2,000 years old country, and probably more. And when I say 2,000, it's not like Israel, who is a mythical country. And even if the Israeli says 2,000, we used to exist 2,000 years ago, that's written in the Bible, but nobody can certify this. And you had this kind of Western country surrounded by enemies of the West. Enemies in a broader sense, because there were some, in some way, related to either Soviet Union or the non-aligned movement, which for the US was considered as enemy, because you are either with us or against us. And even Switzerland had a hard time to use its neutrality, because the US tried many times to put Switzerland into the situation where they had to choose between the East and the West, and Switzerland stayed firm on its neutrality. But that's just to explain that during the Cold War, it was this idea of a kind of black-white system where you are either with us or against us. And Israel was, in that sense, the advanced position of the West. Rightly, because other countries were, as I said, enemies, not enemies, but let's say not very favorable to the West. But today we have a completely different situation. After the end of the Cold War, all these Middle Eastern countries have more or less established strong ties with the West for many reasons. Look at Saudi Arabia, we can even say Syria after what has changed, Egypt, Jordan, even Iraq to some extent, even if they are definitely not totally in favor of the US, and of course the Emirates and all that. The whole context of the Middle East has changed. The Israelis are very much exemplify the problem, but we can see the same with other Western countries. This inability to consider that Iran, in that case, but you can apply that to China, to India, or to Russia, it's the same thing. These are countries that are highly educated, that have a huge tradition in resilience, in leadership, in knowledge management, not in the modern sense, but in the sense of using existing capabilities, especially academic capabilities and all that. And this inability to understand that the Iranians, because they were the target of so many verbal and economic attacks in the past 30 years, that they prepared for that. And in 30 years, this is more than one generation in terms of human life, meaning that they had the time to create, not just to build weapons, but also to create this intellectual base, this industrial base, this engineering base, this all these aspects to build up a system of defense that we have seen in materialize in the resilience of the country. And the fact that the West is not able to understand that strikes me literally, because this was written, this was explicit, this was there, but we are blinded by our arrogance. And that's very true with the Israelis. And that will probably lead to their total defeat at one point, because when you're having, it's good to be self-confident, and we have to be self-confident. I think Israel had two main objectives, and a third one, which is also important, but probably not as important as two first ones. The two first objectives were A, to create a political crisis in Iran, and that obviously failed. And it failed because, and it's interesting because when you listen to, especially in France, for instance, where you don't have much real analysis on the conflict and probably little knowledge of the actors. But in any case, when you hear what you have on mainstream media, you have the feeling that the idea of attacking Iran would be followed almost immediately by a collapse of the government, because 80% or more of the population hates the regime, and therefore that if you decapitate literally, from the Latin to remove the head, if you remove the head of the government, that would allow the country to explode literally. And it's interesting to see that this didn't happen at all. On the contrary, all the reports I've seen show that, in fact, you had, regardless of the political view and the individual view, or the view of individuals, you had a kind of strengthening of the national fabrics, if you want, of the country. Even you had a very strong condemnation coming from the Iranian Jewish community. And the leaders of the Jewish community in Iran condemned vehemently the salvage, they use the word savage attack of Israel. But in fact, during decades, we had this abuse of power that is a dishonor for a military. That explains why you have less and less young Israelis who want to serve in the military. And that shows that probably there is something more fundamental that is rotten within the state of Israel, which is probably the sense of honor, the ethics, the morale, the sense of discipline, and the good common sense. And we have seen that that's been exemplified by the sequence we just saw last week, or in the last 2 weeks, because we have seen that Iran was able to exhaust Israeli capabilities and capacities very quickly, and that Israel was in fact paper tiger. And because nobody talks about the number of Israelis that have left the country and have said they would not come back. And probably those who left the country are probably those who can afford that, meaning they are probably those with some kind of level of education or ability in business or innovation and things like this. And they have seen that probably Israel is no longer the best place to develop their talents. And there are probably other places in the world where they can develop their talents. Therefore, you may well have a country that has been deserted by its elites and just left with those people who, in fact, are probably those extremists whose intellectual level doesn't appear to be extremely high. If you listen to them and the way they behave and the way they consider other nationalities or minorities, I am not sure a country can consider a future just based with people like this. That's my personal view. I might be wrong, but that's my personal view. In any case, we see that the capacities of Israel are definitely not unlimited. And that's very strange that since its inception, Israel has never managed to have a national security policy based on good relation with its neighbors. It has always looked at its neighbors like enemies, and therefore had a kind of an antagonistic posture towards its enemies. That's very interesting. And what is even more interesting is that nobody seems to question that. Even among it, you have a few intellectuals that question that, but there are only a few, and probably just in some universities. But there's barely an influence on Israeli foreign policy. And even today, where you have Israel in the middle of a crisis with Lebanon, a crisis with Syria, a crisis with Egypt, a crisis with Palestinians, a crisis with Iran, who has, let's say, take the initiative for having a dialogue or trying to have a dialogue? The US, not Israel. You never talk about the Israeli foreign policy. You hear them when they complain in a UN General Assembly, that's all. But you have apparently no action of the Israeli foreign policy in trying to solve problems, to talk to others. My understanding is that it's very hard to understand a culture when you are not part of it, and when you have not, let's say, when you have not been in the country itself for the longer period of time, especially when it comes to those countries that have a very different culture, mentality, logic, you name it, than we do in the West. I have lived in other countries outside of Europe, especially in Africa, North Africa, and all that. So I'm aware of the fact that you cannot just look at a country from far away and make a judgment. Societies are much more flexible than we tend to portray them. They are more resilient. And even if we portray these countries, and that applies to Russia, to China, to Iran, and others, we want to portray them as dictatorships because it's convenient for us. It gives us the pretext to consider them as enemies because of our values, which should be defined, by the way. But anyway, but in reality, and that's something that I have said many times, I'm Swiss. France is just next door. But and both countries claim to be democracies. If with my Swiss eyes, I look at France, I see a monarchy, an electoral dictatorship, the monarchy, because the way the country is ruled is something that has nothing to do with what I know in Switzerland. But both countries define themselves as democracies. So the attack on Iran was the minimal service, though it's something against international law. And that also, I think an important take of this the sequence we have just seen is the total collapse of the international law-based order. This law-based order that was created after World War II has totally collapsed. We have those who claim to defend values and whatever, have breached the basic rules of the UN Charter for committing war crimes, because attacking civilian nuclear facilities is a war crime, without any reaction from any European or Western country, meaning that all these countries have tacitly accepted, as they accept the massacre of children and women and elder people in Gaza. It's not new. We have seen that in the past, but here we have a blatant example of the collapse of the international. And in addition to that, to add to that, the On top of this, you have the IU that has failed in fulfilling its mandate, has demonstrated a corrupt leadership, and has demonstrated its inability to implement the principles of what you have in the UN Charter beyond its tasks. The principle of objectivity, neutrality, impartiality, all that was collapsed. And we have seen that already with the OPCV during the Syrian war, where the OPCV, I mean, for the Office Against the Proliferation of Chemical Weapons. And one of my experience in the region is that is there something you can do always when the Middle East is talking about something before struggling and trying to fight. So there is a fundamental issue there that is very strangely, but not very surprisingly, the Israelis have never grasped this idea that the best result you can achieve in terms of security is not to be the strongest and have the biggest army and all that. And in fact, we see that it's failing. The best way to achieve security is to have good relations with people, talk to them. And dialogue is, in fact, the best security. That's very strange that we see exactly the same thing happening in Ukraine, by the way, that instead of trying to solve the problem by negotiation, as the Russians tried to promote and tried to implement with the Minsk Agreement and others, the Europeans are not so keen to talk. They fight. They provide new weapons. This is the EU foreign policy with Kaja Kallas has never managed to have any kind of influence on all these conflicts. Instead, the only way she took influence was to promise to provide weapons. That she is able to do. So there is a fundamental issue here that I think is worth mentioning. Therefore, here when we talk about Iran and the rest of the Middle East, we have a completely different, we should have a different way to see this country, but we don't because most people don't know. Second aspect is that the picture we have of Iran today is largely the picture that was in fact created by the US after the 1979, I mean after the collapse of the Shah regime and the government of the Ayatollah Khomeini and followers. And of course, the whole issue there is that the US was losing one of its main, let's say, strongholds in the Middle East, and therefore they had to demonize the Iranians, the Iran as a country and Iranians at large. And that's exactly what happens. With the support of independentist or separatist movements in the Kurds and the Baluch and the Wazi and others in the country in order to destabilize the country. And that's the picture we have. Again, I have never lived in Iran. I don't know Iran more than what I can read, but I read not just in one direction, I read in all directions, and I try to have the most comprehensive picture of the society. That's exactly what we see at play with the Russians, who use this Clausewitzian principle that war is a continuation of politics with other means, meaning that you're playing with those two pillars alternatively or simultaneously in order to achieve your result. Now, when you look at the Europeans today, probably not 50 years ago, but today, as you see with Israel, they have totally forgotten the pillar related to foreign policy. Everything is based on the defense policy, everything. And they don't even consider that their problem could be solved through diplomacy. And you never hear about the Minister of Foreign Affairs. You mentioned that regarding Israel, but you can say exactly the same about Germany, for instance. You had Annalena Baerbock, but this was just an additional warmonger. Then it was definitely not diplomacy. So that's where you have this the problem. Now, the problem is that the reason why the US and probably no European countries paid attention to that is probably because during the Cold War, Israel was advanced position of the West in the Middle East. And if you look at what you had after, let's say, in the late 40s and up to the early 80s or mid 80s at least, and I think that will become more and more, and especially now that we see that Israel, which used to be this invincible fortress, Western fortress in the Middle East, is in fact not invisible, has become a weak point of the West in the Middle East, has become the problem. If we have today a conflict that develops around this issue with Palestine or with Lebanon or with Iran, this conflict would develop around Israel. And that would jeopardize other project, investment project promised by other countries and countries that are ready to cooperate with the West. So essentially, Israel has become a liability and no longer a benefit from the West. And I think Israel should think about this, because then that would probably help Israel to play more with its second pillar of the national security policy, instead of relying exclusively on the defense policy and an aggressive stance towards its neighbors. Probably I would suggest that for Israel it would be a good idea to elaborate on foreign policy and develop more better ties with its neighbors, try to solve problems related to the Palestinians and solve them intelligently based on the international law and not just based on gut feeling as they do now. And that would probably be the best guarantee for the survival of Israel. You cannot, as you said, it's unsustainable to have a security policy exclusively based on defense. And I think only the Iranians at this stage are able to define exactly what happens and the extent of the damage and the consequences for the future. For the rest, we don't know. But apparently, the damages were, again, I have to be very prudent here because I don't have more indication than anybody, but my view is that this was limited. Probably it had consequence, probably it touched some sensitive equipment, but it doesn't seem to be full-fledged attack on Iran. You see, you have on three sites, and on one site, probably the one that Isfahan, that could have been probably the most vulnerable. They only used Tomahawk missile that apparently provided or only superficial damages. In any case, we have seen that Trump has done that a little bit as homework he has to do to please both Netanyahu and probably some neocons in the US government, and that was it. And after that, he claimed a big victory, and that reminded me a little bit what my mother used to do when we were fighting against each other as kids. We were fighting, and I won, and the other, my sister said I won, and everybody won and everybody lost. And to calm things down, my mother used to say, "You have both won." And that's exactly what we have seen here. That was more a question of making everybody happy. The Israelis are happy because they won. We destroyed this, and it was spectacular and fantastic. And we mentioned previously the Israelis, the US, and all that. And it's not a coincidence. The Israelis come from Europe. They don't have any cultural tie with the Middle East. Any. All these politicians that you have in Israel, in fact, have Polish, Hungarian, Russian or Ukrainian name. I don't know now but in fact, they changed their name in order to look like Middle East people. But Netanyahu, this is not his real name. All these people like Ben-Gvir and all that, they don't, Smotrich either. This is not their real name. It's an adjusted name because Netanyahu originates from Poland. So these people, they don't have the cultural background of the region. They come with a cultural background that comes from Central Europe. And that's the reason why they cannot understand this area where they claim they belong to since 2000 years. They have nothing in common with what you have in the region. And that, I think, is one of the factors that explains this inability to understand their adversary. It's also an inability to address, because when you don't know your enemy, you tend to have an aggressive stance instead of trying to talk to him. It's normal human behavior, probably. The problem is that when you are at the level of a state, that you don't play with your foreign policy tools in order to integrate yourself in the regional community. But too much is too much. Very self-confident is good, but too much is too much. And that's exactly what we have seen. And that's exactly what we have seen in that last sequence is, in fact, reminiscent to the arrogance we have seen of the West attacking Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and all that, where they never managed to have the situation under control. At no point. At absolutely no point. They killed a lot of people. They made a lot of destruction. But there is a total inability to gain control over a situation. And I would suggest that in that new context that has emerged since 30 years, Israel is no longer the only advanced position of the West. So it has lost its strategic value. The problem is that the Israelis have not realized this. And we see that because Trump, who is a pragmatic person, who tends to act tactically without a strategy, he reacts on opportunities. He's a businessman. It's the type of business you may find in New York. You jump from opportunity to opportunity. That's exactly what he does. There is no elaborated strategy and things like this. Is just opportunity and the next opportunity and all that. And in that context, he has established stronger ties with Saudi Arabia, for instance. Remember, recently, as he was there, he was promised an investment of 600 billion or whatever. And so we see that the importance of Israel, which is in fact almost, not exactly 100%, but it's largely supported by the US and other Western countries, that would probably not survive economically just based on its own capacities. Israel is a cost. There is no benefit beyond having a moral interest in supporting Israel. There's no real interest supporting Israel today. Netanyahu is the bravest of the bravest. And at the same time, you had this response from Iran, which was in fact designed to be limited, but it was bragged as a fantastic victory. And of course, Iranians alarmed before, and that's very fair and all that. So everybody was a winner. And in my view, this approach, which I can understand from a human point of view, if you want, because Trump doesn't want to have this kind of conflict. Again, his priority is to make America great again. And to do that, he has to concentrate its efforts on China. And therefore, dispersing efforts on conflict in Ukraine, Palestine, and Iran, all that is distraction from its main objective. And that's the reason why he would like to solve that. Not to solve the problem. I think that's important. But he wants to have silence. He doesn't want to have this conflict anymore. This shouldn't be that shouldn't be a handicap for his men to reach his own objective, and therefore he wants to get rid of them. Without, by the way, it's interesting. Without, and that's valid for the three conflicts. Without looking for long-term solution, a real peace for this conflict. He just wants to have silence for now. There was a silence in the room so that he can continue his work. That's a little bit what I feel. But at least someone tries to do it. We have to acknowledge that because others don't.